First of all, I'm very happy to be discussing with you because at least we don't have to, your comrades, right? Tabarish, as the Russians would say. Because we don't have to start with this question about whether you want inequality to be the source of growth or you want inequality to be, this is the other view, right? Inequality as a source of growth. The other way is that I think a lot of us share the idea that inequality is a source of instability, economic instability, and actually an obstacle to growth and an obstacle to development. So I'm not going to go through that because this is a sort of underlying framework, right? The other thing to think about this topic that I wanted to talk about is sources of financing for development, right? Or sources for sustainable development finance. There are two things. One is the current crisis, which I will touch on a little bit, and the other one is the long-term issues, which are the systemic issues, the kind of reforms that we need at the international level. There's another two ways to think about the sources of finance for development, right? One way is to think about what are the things that happen that take your money out for development, right? That take the money that you could have used, financing that you'd have used for development. And the other side, and let me give some examples. One is intellectual property rights, this kind of things that are happening in CIADI, in ICSID, right? Another one is the tax capital flight, right? This takes money out from what you could do for development. And again, there's a lot of inequality here, right? Because only the rich can take their money out, right, of the country. A third example is just the rescue of the private banking system, right? I think in this crisis, we have spent at least $16 trillion, right, to rescue the private banks in the United States and in Europe. And this is taxpayers' money. This is, a raid, a raid on the taxpayers' money, the money that has been earned by people to rescue these private companies, right? And as Oscar said, a lot of this, like the financial transaction tax, is actually a redistributive element because most of this tax is actually going to fall on the rich. The other side is how to mobilize new money, how to mobilize finance, right? So we talked about the financial transaction tax. We can mobilize new public resources. I understand that you had a discussion about what we call domestic resource mobilization, right? Taxation in the earlier, right? There are all kinds of, there are at least 6 ways in which the UN used to think about development finance. One is domestic resource mobilization, taxation, investment in infrastructure. Number 2 is foreign direct investment, of which we know there are many examples. Number 3 is trade. Running an export surplus is one way to get financing for development. Of course, you can do all kinds of trade surpluses, but you can take it from mining, right? And then the mining actually does not provide you with anything. The other thing that's happening with FDI is there is this new topic called global value chains, right? And in the case of global value chains, the importation of the goods in order to produce the next stage of the production, because this means that intermediate trade, it does not really provide the foreign exchange to the country that is importing the good that is going to be a part of the product that they will produce. To give you an example, China, in the case of China, 70% of the value of China's exports, this has been estimated, is actually imported by China, right? So actually the value added of China is very small. I saw a calculation that in the iPhone, they're very famous for the iPhone, with all of the exploitation of workers in living in dormitories. Their value added in the iPhone is only 4%, right? For the iPhone, which is mostly produced in China, but then their own value added is very small. Okay, so that's foreign direct trade. Number 4 is official development assistance, and again we can have a lot of discussion about conditionalities and the I don't want to digress, right? But one of the big things about ODA these days is what they call good governance, right? Good governance and rule of law. Actually, the problem for us about the good governance and rule of law is that it doesn't seem to apply at the international level, right? Sebastian talked about the fact that there are only 15 lawyers that are doing all of this arbitration, right? And they have conflicts of interest. Sometimes they sit against the country, sometimes they support the country, and then they sit on the arbitration panel. Another example of bad governance at the international level, you know how the debt resolution is. They do it through the Paris Club. But then they ask the World Bank and the IMF to compute how much the country is supposed to pay. But they themselves are creditors. This is a conflict of interest, right? If it's, but then under ODA, they're not going to give the country any ODA unless it has good governance. Well, they're talking about corruption and all that stuff, but the international system is very corrupt. The next item is debt, right? You know that there is a problem with debt, that there is no resolution mechanism. And the last problem is systemic issues, right? And I will then try to go through all of these. Yeah? But let me first talk about the current crisis. Our view is that the global economy is now shifting to another phase, which will now cause a lot of trouble for developing countries, particularly in Latin America, which is heavily indebted because of the time when, after the crisis, a lot of foreign investment and a lot of portfolio flows went into Latin America. Now we know, I mean, Oscar is a long time friend, you know. In 82 and in 94, in 82 there was a debt crisis that started in Mexico. In 94 there was another debt crisis in Mexico. In 97 there was a debt crisis that started in Thailand. We know that when the interest rates go up internationally, capital flow reverses, right? And countries that have undertaken a lot of debt will get into trouble. So we are about to see Latin America, many African countries, and Asian countries get into trouble. This is part of the discussion in this waving or drowning paper, right? That I think I have brought enough copies almost for everyone. And part of we talked about how there was a temporary large increase in growth in Latin America, right? Part of the increase in Latin America was also because of high commodity prices, right? The fact that iron ore began to be exported to China and all that stuff. Now China's growth is coming down, all right? So the region is facing a very important financing problem, right? So this is on the negative side of the financing, right? And it is, for us, it is very important that networks like you, who are on the same side as we are, right, are warned about this, and that your governments are going to begin to justify ways in which you will keep the foreign investors and the foreign creditors happy, and then to start cutting back on the kind of public financing that you have had, right? One way, for example, to think about Brazil is the following. They have been very successful in the Bolsa Familia, I think they call it. But this is what they did is they invested the high commodity prices in the in anti-poverty, which is a good thing, right? Instead of wasting it on projects that the rich can then invest abroad, right? Their money. But the problem now is that if that money disappears, right, how can Brazil continue to grow, right? For us, one of the weaknesses in Latin America is that it has been deindustrializing. I think you have this discussion here anyway, right? It has been becoming more dependent on commodity exports, and there has been no ability to actually create permanent productive jobs for people, right? Except for financial speculation. So that's one. That's one. I said I will talk about the current crisis, and then I will talk about long-term reforms that are needed. There are many long-term reforms that are needed, right? If you talk about the sources of finance, because the international system does not really provide stable, predictable, long-term finance, right? It does not, right? The only way for a country like Uruguay or a country like Brazil or a country like the Philippines is able to get long-term finance is to encourage speculation in assets in the country, right? And in the last few years, there has been a lot of financing that is coming in because of what they call the quantitative easing, right? Quantitative easing, which is the printing of money by the United States and Europe, right? And this money has come in, right? And it has gone into your stock market. It has gone into real estate. And now it is about to reverse because the United States is about to raise interest rates. You know this 1982, 1994, 1997, even before probably. So this is the kind of thing that a lot of us met each other during the 1982 debt crisis, right? So this is the problem here is that how do you make the global economy provide steady long-term finance for development, right? How can you do that? The way we see it is that there needs to be different institutions internationally. Okay, one of the biggest sources of instability is the fact that this, reserve issuing countries whose reserves become international reserves of other countries, right? Have no disciplines, have no international disciplines on them. They can print as much money as they want, and the other developing countries put it in their reserves. And then they can suddenly stop printing money, which is about the United States is threatening now. So there's an international problem that a lot of the rich countries, right, can just decide to print money, right, which can be good for us. I mean, it could be a nice drug for a few years, but it can be a problematical drug when it starts the resources, the flows start to reverse back, right? And this is actually a privilege that rich countries have, which our countries do not have. In economics, they call this seigniorage, the ability to print money. And one of the things that we're actually suggesting is that this should be under the global control. This should be under the control of all governments in the UN and all that stuff, right, through the UN. But right now, it is the United States holding on, and the European Union trying to protect this privilege in order to print the money. Think about what you could do, right, with if these countries were forced to apply the seigniorage, the fact that they could print money for a global purpose, right? First of all, it would really be possible to have a lot of money for development in a non-political. The problem with ODA is very political, right? In a non-political way, which could then be allocated. I mean, you can think about some kind of thing. For example, I think the U.S. GDP is like 13, 14 trillion US dollars, right? If you think that if the U.S. were required, right, to put into a central fund 1% of its GDP every year, because anyway it is printing that money, it is using that money, it is going outside, and the money that they print it will be used to import their goods, the goods that they produce, right? So it's actually for their own good. If they can contribute 1% every year, that is like a trillion, more, 140 billion, right? Which is this is the total aid that is coming from the ODA, right? And if you can put it into a fund, this is the same kind of discussion that Oscar talked about 60 billion, 60 billion for the financial transaction taxes as a possibility, right? So what we are looking for actually in terms of finance is, number one, non-political funding that is provided without political conditionality. You don't have to be a good boy or good politically in order to get that funding. And secondly, we want it to be predictable. 5 minutes, yeah. I will try to finish quickly, right? So it's for us, that is one route. It's very important to think of reforms in the international system. What I like about the word that Don, and actually it's also being used by the Secretary General's report, right, the eminent panel. What I like about Don and Secretary General is the use of the word transformative. But what does it, what I'd like you to do is to think about what does transformative mean. What we mean by transformative is to actually change the way the economy works in a fundamental way. Now, this Secretary General's report that you're considering, and I agree very much with the criticism that came from Don, the critique that came out of Don, is saying that because the U.S. and the EU are in crisis, they don't have any money anymore for development finance, and then they want to say, well, therefore we must rely on the private sector and we must rely on civil society, which civil society is actually a code word for the private foundations. I mean, I used to work at a private foundation, but for us, what is most important, right, is to think about, the problem with this is giving an excuse to developed countries, the rich countries, not to regulate their financial system, because only by regulating their own financial system will we be able to unlock the kind of long-term financing that countries can have. This also means that developing countries should have the power to decide what kind of investment they want. You know, if they do not want short-term speculative investment, they should be able to impose controls on that kind of investment. They don't really need the kind of financing that can suddenly reverse and cause a deep economic crisis. And we, I mean the older people among us, have experienced what kind of setback this will happen, right? Permanent setbacks to development because of the kind of economic crisis that they actually happen. So, just to summarize very quickly, because it's good to have a discussion, right? We are thinking that now it's about time to have another crisis, a very big crisis of payments and sources of financing for developing countries. The commodity prices will go down, interest rates will go up, capital flows will reverse, and in every country, in every developing country, the domestic political structure has to figure out a way to respond to this, right? And one easy way to respond to this is to say, well, we have to pay the debt, we have to keep our rich happy so that they will continue investing in our country, or you could think of it as an occasion for actual change. That's number one. Number two, there are many important long-term reforms that have to be done at the international system, and this is actually what it means to have a transformation of the global system. The global system has to be transformed so that it provides financing in a steady, long-term way that actually is required for development. Yeah, thank you very much.